disappearing into the snowy night. The next few days were a blur for the town. Thomas was nowhere to be found. His house, now nothing more than smoldering ruins, was the only trace of his recent presence. The people who had been so charmed by him, those who had hung on his every word, couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the man they thought they knew. Was the fire an accident? Was it something more? Had it been a cry for help, an expression of his deeper struggle, or was it just another twist in the chaotic life of the boisterous man? The truth was, no one knew. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. Thomas O'Brien had become a mystery, even to those who had spent months trying to decipher the enigma of his existence. The aftermath of the fire marked a turning point in Thomas's life in Dunmore. The walls that he had so carefully built around himself were now shattered. The larger-than-life persona that had once captivated the town had crumbled, leaving behind a man who was lost and adrift. And though the town tried to reach out to him to offer comfort, Thomas had withdrawn further into the shadows of his own mind. The boisterous man who had once held the town in the palm of his hand had retreated into silence, and the people of Dunmore could only wonder what lay behind the mask he had so skillfully crafted. As winter continued to tighten its grip on Dunmore, the town became shrouded not only in snow but in an atmosphere of uncertainty. The once energetic, larger-than-life Thomas O'Brien had disappeared into the cold, and with his absence, the town's heart seemed to grow colder as well. People continued to whisper about the fire, but no one had answers. Where had Thomas gone? What had happened to the man who had once been the spark of every conversation, the loud, boisterous character who had brought life to their otherwise predictable routines? It was weeks before anyone saw Thomas again. When he reappeared, it was not with the same grand entrance that had marked his arrival months before. No, this time he crept back into town like a shadow, a specter of the man he once was. It happened on a day when the town was caught in a fierce blizzard. The snow piled up high, blocking the streets and reducing visibility to almost nothing. The sky was an oppressive gray, and the wind howled through the town, rattling windows and sending waves of snow curling around corners. It was in the midst of this storm that the first dramatic moment occurred. The tavern was quieter than usual, the warmth inside offering a rare moment of solace in the frozen landscape. A few locals huddled by the fire, nursing mugs of hot cider or whiskey, when the door to the tavern swung open with a sudden force. The wind whipped in, carrying with it a frigid chill, but it was the figure in the doorway that caused everyone to stop in their tracks. Thomas stood there, framed by the door, his clothes ragged and worn, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes, once full of fire and life, were now hollow and distant. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, if not weeks. His shoulders were hunched, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, as if trying to hide from the world. The sound of the door creaking closed behind him echoed in the room, and the air seemed to hold its breath. The regulars in the tavern stared at him, uncertain whether they were seeing the same man who had once filled their lives with stories and laughter. Thomas didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, looking around as though he were seeing the town for the first time. The silence in the room was thick, but it was broken when Harold, the man who had once tried to reach out to him, stood up and approached.
"Thomas?"
Harold's voice was soft, hesitant, as if testing the waters.
"You okay, man?"
Thomas's eyes flickered over to him, but there was no recognition in them, just a quiet emptiness. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn and walk back out into the storm, but then something shifted. His lips parted, and in a voice that was barely audible, he said,
I don't know what I'm doing anymore."
The words hung in the air, fragile and raw. It was the first time anyone had heard Thomas speak like that, vulnerable, unsure. The bravado that had once been his shield was gone, replaced by a man stripped bare, standing at the edge of some emotional precipice. Harold, not knowing what else to do, gestured toward the empty seat by the fire.
"Come on, sit down. Let's talk."
For the next few hours, the tavern was a quiet space, filled only with the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional murmur of conversation. Thomas did not tell his story all at once. He spoke in fragments, disconnected pieces of the past that seemed to tumble out of him like broken glass. There were mentions of lost friends, of a love he had let slip away, and of moments in his life that he had tried to outrun. As he spoke, his words came in fits and starts, the cracks in his voice betraying the emotions he had long kept buried. But the most dramatic moment came when Thomas spoke of the fire, of the house he had tried to build as a new beginning. He described how he had poured his soul into that place, trying to make it something to hold on to, something to escape the demons of his past.
I thought it would be my redemption. I thought if I could make it real, if I could make something of myself, maybe I could start over.
He looked up at the fire as though it could answer him.
But the fire, it just destroyed everything. Everything I built. And maybe it was supposed to. Maybe I'm not meant to build anything. Maybe I'm just a man who keeps burning things down.
The vulnerability in his words struck everyone in the room like a physical blow. It was clear now. Thomas wasn't just some loud, boisterous man who had wandered into town with wild tales and big dreams. He was a man who had been running from something deeper, something that had been gnawing at him for years. The fire had not been an accident. It had been an act of self-destruction, a cry for help disguised as an uncontrollable blaze. As the conversation continued, Harold quietly pulled the townsfolk into a circle. One by one, they began to share their own stories with Thomas. They spoke of their regrets, their losses, their mistakes. In the warmth of the firelight, something miraculous happened. Thomas stopped feeling like an outsider. He was no longer the eccentric stranger who had just dropped in for a fleeting moment. He was a part of the town now, and the town in turn was a part of him. But just as the night seemed to settle into a sense of understanding, an unexpected visitor arrived. Margaret, the wife of the local sheriff, entered the tavern with a look of urgent concern. She had been searching for Thomas, worried about his isolation. Margaret, who had known Thomas from the moment he had arrived in Dunmore, had always felt a maternal protectiveness toward him. She had seen through the bravado and understood that there was more to his story than he let on.
Thomas,
she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of concern.
I need to talk to you. Now.
Thomas looked up at her, and for a moment, there was something in his eyes that hinted at recognition, a flicker of understanding. He didn't argue. He simply stood and followed her outside, leaving the warmth of the fire behind. The storm had picked up in intensity, the wind howling as they stepped into the blizzard. Margaret led him down the street toward the old sheriff's office, her footsteps quick and purposeful in the snow. She didn't speak at first, but when they reached the door, she turned to face him.
Thomas, you've been running away from something, and it's time to stop running. You don't have to do this alone. We've all seen what you can do, what you've brought to this town. But you need to deal with whatever's inside you. You can't keep burying it.
Thomas stood frozen for a moment, the cold biting at his skin, the weight of her words settling in. It was as if a dam had broken inside him, and he suddenly realized that he couldn't outrun his past any longer.
I don't know how.
He admitted, his voice thick with emotion.
I don't know how to face it.
Margaret stepped closer, her presence a steady comfort in the storm.
You don't have to have all the answers. But you do have people here who care about you, Thomas. Don't shut us out.
For the first time in months, Thomas felt the walls around him begin to crumble. Margaret's words, the people in the tavern, the town that had slowly come to embrace him, they were his lifeline. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was completely alone. And in that moment, with the storm howling around him, Thomas made the decision that would alter the course of his life. He would stop running. He would face the darkness he had been avoiding for so long. But it would take time. And it would take the support of those who had come to care for him. The reckoning had come, and with it, the possibility of redemption, not through grand gestures or wild tales, but through the quiet act of confronting his past and finding a way to live with it. The days after that fateful conversation in the snowstorm became a turning point for Thomas O'Brien. The path ahead was not clear, and the weight of what he had to face was overwhelming, but for the first time he felt a flicker of hope. The boisterous man who had once seemed larger than life, a spectacle in the town of Dunmore, was now facing the quiet, terrifying work of confronting his past. The reckoning had begun, but it was only in the stillness that followed that the true challenge emerged. The first dramatic shift in Thomas's journey came when he returned to the ruins of his house. The fire had reduced it to little more than charred beams and piles of ash, but it remained a symbol of his struggle, the place where he had tried to rebuild himself and had failed. He had avoided the site since that night. The sight of the smoldering remains a painful reminder of his brokenness. But now, standing on the edge of the wreckage, he finally allowed himself to face the reality of his loss. It was early in the morning, and a light mist hung over the snow-covered ground. The town was still asleep, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the frosty earth. Thomas walked carefully through the charred remains of his former sanctuary. His hands, cold and stiff from the chill, brushed over the blackened wood, each touch a painful reminder of what he had tried to create and destroy. There was no grand revelation here, no dramatic epiphany, just the quiet acceptance of what had happened, of the failure that had once haunted him. He sat down on the frozen ground among the ruins and closed his eyes, allowing the silence to wash over him. For the first time in months, Thomas didn't feel the need to escape, to fill the void with stories or performances. He was alone, stripped of his persona, but in that solitude, he found something he hadn't realized he was missing: peace. The peace, however, was fleeting. It wasn't long before the town took notice of his return. The people of Dunmore had been watching from a distance, unsure of how to approach the man who had once been the center of their lives. It was clear that Thomas had changed. His once larger-than-life persona was gone, replaced by something quieter, more introspective. The town's curiosity grew, and soon they began to reach out, offering their support. The next dramatic moment occurred when Thomas, with the encouragement of the townsfolk, decided to visit the Dunmore Playhouse once more. The theater, though still standing, had fallen into disrepair again, the faded curtains gathering dust in the rafters. When Thomas first came to town, the playhouse had been a symbol of his impulsive creativity, a place he had revived to escape his own inner turmoil. But now, standing before the building, he saw it as something entirely different, a place where he could finally confront his past and rebuild in a way that was more authentic. He arrived at the theater one cold afternoon, the sky overcast and heavy with the threat of snow. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the familiar smell of aged wood and dust filling his nostrils. The stage, which had once been filled with the chaos of his performances, now felt quiet, almost sacred. It was as though the building had been waiting for him to return, not to put on a show, but to truly understand its meaning. Thomas wandered around the darkened room, running his fingers over the dusty seats, the splintered edges of the stage, and the forgotten props scattered in the wings. The place that had once symbolized his escape now felt like a mirror to his soul, broken but capable of being rebuilt. Slowly, he climbed onto the stage, where he had once stood in front of a captivated audience. This time there would be no show. There would be no exaggerated gestures or exaggerated stories. Just silence. Just him. For the next few hours he stood on that stage, reflecting on his journey. There were no grand speeches or dramatic monologues. There was no performance to distract him from the work ahead. Thomas simply let himself feel everything: the sorrow, the guilt, the shame, but also the flickers of hope that had begun to ignite within him. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, standing there in the empty theater, confronting the broken pieces of his life and, for the first time in a long while, accepting them. Later that day, Margaret visited him at the theater. She had been one of the few to truly understand the depths of his struggle, and she saw the change in him. When she walked in, she found him sitting on the stage, his back against the cracked wooden floor, staring up at the ceiling as if searching for something in the shadows.
How does it feel?
She asked gently, taking a seat beside him.
It feels like I'm finally starting to see myself, Not as the man I pretended to be. Not as the showman. Just me. And it's terrifying, but it's also freeing.
Margaret smiled softly.
You're not alone in this, Thomas. You never were. The town is here for you, and we'll rebuild this place together. One step at a time.
That night, for the first time in months, Thomas slept soundly. He dreamed of a future where he wasn't defined by his past mistakes or the walls he had built around himself. He dreamed of a life where he could stand in front of others, not to perform but to simply be. The real test of Thomas's transformation came when he decided to return to the community that had once embraced him. The people of Dunmore had watched his downward spiral, and many were unsure how to react to the new, quieter version of Thomas. Would they still accept him? Would they see the man he had become, or would they only remember the brash, loud showman? The opportunity came when the town organized a small gathering at the tavern, a casual meeting to discuss the future of Dunmore. Thomas was invited, but he wasn't sure what to expect. He had no plans to make a speech or take center stage. He simply wanted to be a part of the town again, to reconnect with the people who had given him a second chance. When he entered the tavern that evening, the familiar faces turned toward him. There was a moment of silence as everyone took in his presence, but this time it wasn't an awkward silence. It was one of anticipation. Thomas didn't rush to speak. Instead, he found an empty seat at the bar and simply observed. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. He didn't need to be. As the meeting continued, people began to speak up, about their hopes for the town, about the challenges they faced, about the way Dunmore had become a community again, even without the theater or grand performances. And slowly, the conversation shifted. It became about more than just rebuilding a town. It became about rebuilding lives. At the end of the evening, the bartender, who had known Thomas since his arrival, raised a glass.
To new beginnings.
He said with a smile, his voice warm with sincerity.
To Thomas, who reminded us that life isn't about the show we put on, it's about the people we become.
The room erupted in quiet applause. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of belonging, not as a performer, but as a man who had found his place in the world, not by boasting of his grand achievements, but by simply being present. In the months that followed, Thomas continued to rebuild. Not just his life, but the town's connection to the theater, now transformed into a community center. He no longer sought the spotlight, but he became an integral part of the town's fabric. The boisterous man who had once filled the space with noise and drama had finally found peace, not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady work of everyday life. The rebirth of Thomas O'Brien wasn't marked by a dramatic performance. It was marked by the small, sometimes painful steps of self-acceptance and healing, supported by the community that had never truly given up on him.